I've asked you to read A History of My Brief Body, and I've also asked you to quote a favorite passage on the discussion forum. So let's start with one of my favorite passages. This is my job, to report from the scene of an undead past colliding with a still to be determined future. I like this passage because it displays a real economy of words for quite a big concept. Isn't this what we all are doing when we write memoir? And in the case of Billy-Ray Belcourt, Billy-Ray Belcourt is also making a political statement. He is writing about his own narrative within the narrative of Indigenous peoples within so-called Canada. So both his personal narrative is still to be determined, but the political narrative of Canada is also to be determined. And he doesn't know where history or his future will take him. And he is reporting upon his own past as well as the past of, to a certain degree, Indigenous peoples more generally. So this is a really big statement. And this is also the thesis of this book. I think that Billy-Ray Belcourt writes in a big way. He writes big ideas. He's fairly verbose in his writing, but he has an economy of words. He does not use filler words in his writing. He doesn't use use excess words to express a concept. Let's look at this quote as well. In the Museum of Political Depression, in its tidied halls, books of the sort I want to write are banned, for they emerge from a banned way of thinking that pry open space to live outside in an uninhabitable world. I think I've spoken about a promise to the reader before. When you're writing a piece of work, it doesn't just have to be memoir, it doesn't just have to be creative nonfiction. You allow the reader to get a sense of what the story or the writing or the book is going to be about on those first few pages. And this is certainly the case if you're writing a longer work, but it's also the case if you're writing a shorter work, usually too. So if I am writing a memoir, let's say, I'm going to make sure that the opening pages disclose the direction I'm going to take. It's not going to give away all the secrets of the story, by no means, but it is going to give the reader a sense of where they're going, where are they investing their time. This is a statement that I think really suggests what Billy-Ray Belcourt is trying to accomplish in this piece. So he writes, books of the sort I want to write are banned, for they emerge from a banned way of thinking that pry open space to live otherwise in an uninhabitable world. And then he goes on to write about intimate scenes of his sexual life and his sexual encounters, very personal scenes. He goes on to write about very controversial subjects. He writes about a controversial way of thinking. So I see this, when I read this, I see this as a kind of a promise to the reader. We know that we are going to get something that we might not get anywhere else, or at least we're not going to get in the same way anywhere else. I also want to point out a bit about his style here in this passage. So let's read through this. NDN boys are ideas before they are bodied. Our lives are muffled by a flurry of accusations that outrun us. Ideas of this vexed sort leave a burnt path in their wake. Feet like ours like ours, are singed with a history that isn't done with us. There is a point at which Indian boys can become angry men of at least two types: one that is imprisoning and riotous at once, a mode of being that sucks the air out of the room, and another that is quite but equally denigrating, a slow injunction on happiness and possibility. That should read quiet, not quite. Billy-Ray Belcourt's style is both poetic and academic. I find that really interesting. Who would think that a style could be both poetic and academic? But I think we see it right here. The style that he is writing in is poetic. We see rhetorical schemes here. We see a rhythm to his language. Remember in the lecture I talked about rhythm. That feeling like this is very easy to read. It flows off the tongue. There's that bum, ba bum, ba bum, ba bump as you read through it. There's also a strong political message here. And one of the things that I see throughout here is Billy-Ray Belcourt's use of reasoning and logic. All of his arguments throughout this book are reasoned arguments. At the same time, he has this poetic way of writing, which I find really quite refreshing. I appreciate creative nonfiction writers who do have a poeticism to their writing, a lyricism. Sometimes it's called lyricism. Another thing that I wanted to point out in here, within the portions of the book that I assigned you, he often uses these kinds of quotes where he quotes various authors. He's very obviously well read. Other points in the story, in the book, he uses more poetical interludes. But in this portion of the book, he's quoting Roland Barthes, who you might know from communication theory. If you don't know Roland Barthes yet, you probably will in the future. Roland Barthes' Morning Diary is a record of a struggle with aliveness, a struggle that eschews and indeed consumes the primacy of writing. I, in my 20s, feel a lot like Barthes in his 60s, grief-stricken without the nucleus of his affective life, his mother. So someone as well read as Billy-Ray Belcourt can pull from these various sources to build this kind of rational argument throughout the book. Now I want to return to the thesis of this piece, so I'm going to just go back. This is my job, to report from the scene of an undead past colliding with a still-to-be-determined future. He comes back to this idea in the last chapter, the one that I assigned at the end of the book. So yes, he's a memoirist, and so of course he's writing about the past that is colliding with a still-to-be-determined future. But as I said, his message is also political. So this is the opening to the final chapter. Activists doused the statue of John A. Macdonald in Montreal in red paint a number of times in 2018. In so doing, they refused to live according to what Christina Sharp calls monumental time, in which history is motionless, dead, and outside the ethical tonalities of the present. Instead, the activists insisted on a politics of accusation thrown into focus, the longue durée of state-sanctioned violence against Indians in Canada. And then he goes on to talk about that and why it happened and what it might mean. So I see this as a return to that thesis. So he's told us about his life and some of his ideas and his thoughts about Indians in Canada, and now he is going to the end of the story and segueing towards the future. What does the future hold for Indigenous peoples in so-called Canada. And here he is transitioning to what the future might bring for the political landscape of the future and for activism in the future Canada. And I find this kind of interesting because he doesn't come out and say it, but this is a turning point in Canadian history. It's astonishing how much knowledge of residential schools, of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Indigenous issues, how it has evolved in the last decade. It is staggering. I remember teaching at the university. When I was teaching visual communications, I would always bring up various issues of the gaze and appropriation and ideas like that. And I remember the year that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came through Edmonton. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had been touring Canada for a number of years. It was not a new thing, it was in the news. And I remember asking how many people in the class knew that it was in Edmonton or had heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And no one put up their hand, or maybe one person put up their hand. I did this a couple of times. And this was in McEwen, and this was probably, gosh, I can't remember the year, but it was probably about 2014. So that's a mere 8 years ago. Now most people know about residential schools. Most people know about the land back movement, or if they don't, they have an inkling that it might be out there or something's happening with that. Most people have a much better sense of the issues that many Indigenous people have faced in the past and continue to face within this country. Many people just have a better sense of the issues generally, even if they don't know the specifics behind them. And so that's quite a big shift in 8 years. So this, to me, this scene that he's painting right here is that flashpoint when things started to really change, when white allies sided with Indigenous peoples and in large numbers said, this isn't right and we shouldn't be celebrating this anymore. So this is the turning point that he's pointing out to here. So this is the undetermined, or the to be determined future that he's pointing to in his thesis statement. Okay, so I hope that helps to illuminate a bit more about the book, and I hope you enjoyed reading it. I hope you get a chance to read the entire book. I will also post an interview with Billy-Ray Belcourt that you might find interesting, and I look forward to your responses to the response assignment as well.